Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be both a reading project plan, but also kind of a check-in for a readathon. Katie from Books and Things is hosting a readathon this month called the TBR Clearout, which encourages people to read the books that they have at home, which I think is convenient for anybody who does a lot of their book shopping in person when bookshops are in general closed right now in most countries. And also libraries are mostly closed, although I'm fortunate in that both of the libraries that I belong to have quite extensive online options, so that's less of an issue for me. But again, it is nice to think about reading one's own books every now and then. And I did, not that long ago, acquire the box set of the Penguin Little Black Classics, and I thought it would be interesting to read through a bunch of these, because I had seen a number of people when this was first released getting this, and a lot of them were sponsored. And of course, because people get things for free or are paid to talk about them, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't trust them. But I paid for these myself, so I feel like I'm more willing to complain about it than some people might be. Now, to be fair, I did get it at a very cheap price, so, which is the only reason I bought them. But anyway, because it's a bunch of short books, I have been putting off reading them because they're so short. You think, well, I can read that sometime when I don't have a lot of time. But if you keep putting things off, you never read them, regardless of how much time you have. So I did think it would be a good idea to pick up some of these for this TBR Clearout readathon, and this could be the start of this project where I read through these. Because I've also been thinking, kind of, because I've had conversations in the comments of other people's channels, and on Twitter actually, about things like abridged versions and children's versions and things like that. And these are not those. What these are they're described as snippets in the market, and some of them are certainly single items. There are single long short stories or a small collection of 2 to 4 short stories, or one long essay, or a pairing of short essays. Short collections of poetry, for example. But a few of them are really excerpts of larger works. For example, the first book in this box set is called Mrs. Rosie and the Priest, and this is Giovanni Boccaccio, which these are of course stories from the Decameron. Now the Decameron is essentially a collection of 100 short stories, but without the framing device, is that the right way to read them? Probably not. Now, I've never been particularly interested in reading all of the Decameron. I think it's kind of an amusing thing that people look at to go, hi, hey, did you know that medieval people like to tell funny stories about sex? And I think there's value to that, because I think the fact that people are surprised that medieval people were people in the same way that we are, deserves to be out there, and not everybody wants to read whatever it is. It's over 1,000 pages, because it is 100 short stories plus this framing device of people fleeing the plague and telling stories to each other as they're hiding out in the woods. I have read selections from this before. Back when I was in high school, I think there was a similar kind of excerpt in a book of short stories. So this isn't my first introduction to it, but I had kind of a similar reaction to when I read other stories from it before, in that some of these are amusing. This has 4 stories in it, and I thought 2 of them were very amusing. One of them was fine, and one of them was, wow, has not aged well. It was the 14th century. Of course it didn't age. That's not that bad, but at the same time, it didn't inspire me to go and read more. Now, not all of these are specifically excerpts from larger work. For example, another one that I have read over the past week was Thomas de Quincey's On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts. This is a satirical essay from the early 19th century. It is still reasonably funny. I think when you look at a lot of 19th century essayists, they tend to read really pretentiously today just because there are so many classical references. I was surprised by how entertaining this was, but I think your mileage may vary in terms of all of those classical references, because I read this as being quite similar to reading a lot of kind of cultural commentators now who make pop culture references, because I thought it read the same way. I thought that was kind of hilarious, just in terms of the way things never change, except that his references were to, 4,000-year-old poems as opposed to ones from a year-old TV series, for example. But regardless of that, this is an individual thing on its own, so there is maybe a reason to have this packaged on its own. And I was entertained by it, so I think that's kind of a win-win on both sides, because it's not an excerpt and it was amusing. I'm actually not sure that it matters if these things are entertaining, because I think what's interesting with a collection like this is that I don't necessarily think you're reading it because you're interested in every single item. I think it's an interesting exercise in saying, well, I've never read any Tang Dynasty poets, and I feel like I should, but I'm not that interested, so I'll read this short collection, because that is one of the things in this box set, although I have not read that one yet. So I think there's some value in that, because you get a taste of a number of different things that you might not be considering otherwise. But, so, I guess that's the point. In any case, in addition to those, I also read Gerard, Manley, Hopkins As Kingfishers Catch Fire. This is a collection of poetry which was on theme for National Poetry Month in addition to this particular project. This is a collection of poetry by a Victorian priest, and he was a Jesuit Catholic priest, which I mentioned just because a lot of this is nature poetry that plays with a style of rhyming that's more similar to older poetry than it is to other Victorian poetry. This was actually published after his death, so it was actually published in a post-Victorian era, but when he was writing it, it's kind of interesting that way. So I thought the nature poetry elements were interesting. If you follow me on Instagram, I posted one of the pages there. But a lot of it is also quite religious, which for a priest is not surprising. And actually, when I first picked this up, I hadn't noticed that he was a priest. I thought he was some kind of Protestant vicar. So I was not as surprised by the style of religion in the poetry, but I kind of associate Jesuits with a more intellectual style of religion, and this felt more religious, if that makes sense, which is not particularly interesting for me, but did surprise me just given the context of the kind of educational background he would have had as that type of priest. So this was more interesting than I thought it was fantastic, but do you want to read Victorian poetry that doesn't feel like Victorian poetry? This might be interesting. It wasn't something that I was particularly looking for, but I feel like having read that, I will say the one flaw of this is that you don't have notes in any of these, and I am a big fan of notes when you're reading any kind of historical work that has some kind of historical importance, and I felt like the lack of that was too bad. These were definitely all things where I went and read stuff on Wikipedia afterwards, because I think with a lot of it you need to know some of the context of why is this important, who was this person, what is the historical context around this writing. Because the other thing that I read was the Saga of Gunnlaug, Serpent-tongue. This is an Icelandic epic, and it was translated by Katrina Atwood. This was interesting in that I didn't particularly enjoy the first half of it, which does a lot of setting up things and describing characters who are now exit the saga. It says multiple times. It does, in terms of entertainment value, get going near the end, and I was entertained by the way that this mirrored, I think, when you look at a lot of ancient epic. This is something that was from at least the 9th century, but was written down in the 11th century, I believe it is. In any case, this is an old story, and it feels like any of the ancient Mediterranean traditions, but with kind of a different ending, so I thought that was really interesting. So the context around this I did think was super interesting, just outside from the entertainment value of reading the actual saga. I've never been particularly interested in the Norse sagas. I did read the Poetic Edda, is it called? About 15 years ago, which was interesting. I do think one of the kind of fascinating things about this is that the characters within this saga often recite poetry to each other or invent verses for each other. And what the translator has done with that is gone for a really literal translation and then explains in side notes what the translation means. So it will say point goddess, then in the side it'll say Valkyrie, or serpent's bed, gold, things like that. Flinger is a generous man, etc. So this I thought was a lot more interesting just because it had those notes from the translator. So I really do wish that there were more notes in other books. Now, a number of the other things in here are translated, so I'm hoping that those are going to have more. Were these interesting snippets so far? Yes. Were they entertaining? Sometimes. So I feel like this is a fun project because they are so short. There isn't really the same dedication that picking up any random longer work from a similar set of sagas from any given culture or a similar collection of essays or poetry from any given 19th century writer. So I definitely see the value in that. So I feel like it's a worthwhile thing just to have some context. I think as I go through this, I'm going to encounter more of these that are either from authors or cultures that I'm more familiar with, or things that I have actually read in other forms before. So I think that will be interesting just to see if I decide that they're good examples of the wider things or not. Because with these four, as I said, I had read selections from the Decameron before, but not the same one. And with the other three, I wasn't familiar with any of it. Or maybe I was with the Thomas de Quincey, I'm not sure actually. I feel like that might be something I read in a collection in high school too, something from him. In any case, I'm finding this to be an interesting project. I do think that it is a good length for getting a decent taste of things. I'm overall pretty pleased so far, but I don't know if it was for pure entertainment value, if it would have the same value. Or for pure educational value, I feel like you'd be better off focusing on one thing with more depth rather than so many things so narrowly. But for my own, basically, curiosity purposes, I think I'm enjoying it. If you've read a bunch of these, I'd be curious to hear your experience with them. And of course, if you're taking part in the TBR Clearout Readathon, I'd love to hear how you decided on what you're reading and what you are reading. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.